but I'm glad to be here. Now, actually, what I want to talk about, as Hans Martin mentioned, is basically the subject of a new book manuscript, which is finished as a manuscript, but still under review. So we will see what comes of this. And this book is very modestly titled "A Theory of World Politics," and it has basically one question at its core: what is world politics? And if you look at the literature in the field of international relations and beyond, there are surprisingly very few systematic attempts to deal with that question. As you know, international politics, international relations, world politics are very often used quite interchangeably. And even if you look at more thorough attempts to define what an international system is, very often you will find that the notion of a system is also not very clearly defined. However, what I'm not doing at all here is a study in historical semantics. So I'm not primarily interested in the question of when and under which circumstances notions of world politics emerge, although that is also part of my research. I'm more interested in the systematic issue of what is world politics. And in order to approach that systematic issue, I start from another concept with world in it, and that is the concept of world society. And trying to put that very simply, the idea of world society in the way that I use it and others use it is not in the sense of a somehow integrated society. It's not the concept of a society as you have in classical sociology, which requires some kind of normative integration, some form of community or collective identity to hold world society together. But world society is taken to be first and foremost the entirety of all communication. So everything that's communication, everything that is social is society. And in an extension of that thought, there can only be but one society today, and that is world society. Of course, world society, it comes into existence with the full discovery of the globe in the age of discoveries, 16th century at latest. And world society comes into existence exactly at that point when no single society can claim for itself to be world society, with no other society to be outside of it. That is a world society in a very weak sense of society. It's in the sense, it's a society in the phenomenological sense of society. So you cannot pretend that all social meaning is self-enclosed within a local or regional society. You cannot pretend that there is nothing outside of it. You always have to live with the possibility, and nothing more, with the possibility that in all respects you could connect to others around the world, around the globe. That is, of course, something else than the more structural consolidation of that world society. The difference being a difference between the mere possibility of connectivity and the actualization of connectivity. That actually connections across the globe are being established on a more and more regular basis. So this is basically the story of the long 19th century, continuing until the 20th century, of what has come to be known as globalization. With globalization, I do not mean post-Cold War globalization, economic globalization, but the global spread of models of rationality, of models of organization, notions of rational actorhood, and so on, and so on, and so on. So in a sense, very much also what the new institutionalists, the Stanford School, describe as the emergence of world society. I would say this is the structural consolidation of world society. I do not want to take up too much time with talking about world society, but the central issue I'm concerned about is that if a global social whole, let's call it like this, if global sociality can be described as a form of society, then it would certainly be worthwhile to also look at it with some of the basic tools that have been developed in sociology for describing society, and that is the theory of social differentiation. Basically, sociology in itself, as an academic subject, came into being by starting with the observation that obviously something very important had happened in the transition to modernity, and that is that society had become functionally differentiated, that role differentiation, specialization had become to more and more define what society is about, that the evolution of different logics of a political sphere, of an economic sphere, of a religious sphere, of a sphere of education, sphere of science, actually became more dynamic and more important in structuring society than established forms of differentiation, namely a differentiation into the different strata of society, nobility, bourgeoisie, and peasants, whatever you had, which were characteristic of pre-modern society. Now, and sociology basically started with that. I mean, this was when sociology started as a systematic endeavor with people like Spencer, and later in classic sociology, Durkheim. That was a driving motive of the systematic observation of society, that it is functionally differentiated. And in a more specialized form, the theory of social differentiation, I think pretty much uncontested nowadays, talks about three forms of social differentiation that can be found historically. And the historically most antecedent one, the earliest one, is probably segmentation. So when social units are clearly separated into clear-cut segments, tribes, clans, later family, and they are the defining social units in which social interaction takes place. But they are already a differentiation of a society, so they are aware of each others. They are not hunter-gatherer bands that bump into each other inadvertently, bang on each other's head, and then disperse again. They are aware of the fact that they are part of a society. They differentiate society. Then stratification, where actually different levels, different strata define who you are. They define who you are. It is where you stand which defines your chances in politics and in science and in the economy and so on and so on. And then functional differentiation, which in which society is differentiated into highly autonomous, although interrelated spheres that are defined functionally, such as politics and the economy and so on and so on. So the idea is now, well, if world society, as national forms of society, can be characterized by differentiation, as being a socially differentiated society, where's world politics in that? It's quite clear where politics is. World society is a functionally differentiated society. It's primarily differentiated into separate functional spheres. Politics as distinct from law, as distinct from the economics, as distinct from science, and so on and so on. Although this is not to deny that also within world society there is stratification and segmentation. But first of all, the most important form of differentiation of modern society, and world society is a modern form of society, is functional differentiation. And that means there is a political system of world society. Political system of world society, which means, and I hope you can follow me here because it's twisting around conventional usages of these terms quite a bit. Political system of world society, meaning that all political communication is part of the political system. There is no political communication in the economic system because that's defined as being economic communication. All political communication is part of the political system of world society that is one of the functionally differentiated systems of world society. That means, however, that on this level of world society, first of all, we only have functional differentiation. And that if you look in a closer way at the political system of world society, the central question then becomes, well, how is that system in itself structured? How is it differentiated? And the important, and this is the last basic theoretical claim, the important thing here now is to actually say, well, there is absolutely no reason to believe, either historically nor systematically, that this political system of world society in itself is neatly structured into what has come to be known as levels. There's absolutely no need or no reason to actually say, well, this political system of world society, unlike any other of the function systems, is structured according to levels, where on the top level would be the international politics, then some kind of national politics, and whatever you have, local politics. But this political system of world society in itself is also a differentiated social system. It's socially differentiated. And there are actually, as in all social systems, all three forms of social differentiation at play. And the important question is then, to which extent are they at play vis-à-vis each other? So it is quite clear that within the political system of world society, segmentation plays an extremely important role. The political system of world society is differentiated into territorial states. There is absolutely no doubt about this. And these are segments. It's a strong form of segmental differentiation. However, and I will come back to this point later on, there is also, it's absolutely clear that stratification is at play here. You may not call that formal empire nowadays, but informal forms of empire and the long-standing distinction between major powers and small powers, it plays a role, and it structures communication in this political system of world society. And there is certainly also functional differentiation going on. There's functional differentiation going on. Parts of the political system are oriented towards issues of dealing with problems, problem solving, issues of governance, regulation are geared towards that. So all in all, I would say the image that you have a political system that is structured according to a range of levels is misleading. One has to look at the forms of social differentiation at play, and from that on actually ask which forms of structure formation of organizing political authority are supported by these forms of differentiation and the interplay between them. And now, finally, the most narrow claim on what is world politics. The claim is that world politics is nothing less, but also nothing more than a subsystem of the political system of world society. It's a specific form of politics. It's a functionally differentiated subsystem within the political system of world society that deals primarily with the issue and the problem of coordinating relation between segments. Also increasingly more, but that is how it came about. And this, however, means that from a systems perspective, it is not more or less, it's not above or below Ottawa politics or environmental politics or Argentinian politics or whatever kind of politics you've got. It's simply one among many, many subsystems within the political system. And it is an important subsystem, and it is a functionally differentiated subsystem. Now, this system of world politics is a subsystem of the political system of world society, and this is now a more empirical claim. This only came into being in the long 19th century. There was no system of world politics going back before that. Now, on the one hand, this might seem to be a relatively straightforward claim, the fact that functional differentiation of world society is also not something that could be traced back to pre-modern times. But it's also a bit counterintuitive claim when you look at the, of course, quite massive literature of people claiming, well, there have been international systems in world history, and you can compare them, and whatever, you go back 1 millennium, 2 millennia, there have been international systems. Well, I would not dispute that there has always been interaction, and have always been interaction systems between different polities, even over a long distance. But I would dispute that that these lack the characteristic of social systems. Now, why is that? Let me borrow an analogy. Let me borrow an analogy from the world of computing to start with, maybe. Some people in the room may remember the days before the World Wide Web. What you had was some kind of telnet connection. So if you wanted to send a file somewhere, you had to dial up and specific address, then you transferred the file, and you established the connection and transferred the file, and shut down the connection and went back in the other direction, and so on and so on. I would claim that such a simple interaction system is what could be observed actually in pre-modern times. And these were at most proto-systems, and they are, of course, a world apart from the situation of the World Wide Web, where connectivity on a permanent basis is the rule. And I would actually argue that the long 19th century is a time where the development of the file transfer protocol proto-system of world politics to the World Wide Web, a fully developed system of world politics took place. And I think it took place along three lines. It took place because interaction was regularized and stabilized. So it was not just simple transfers here and there, but regularized, and we'll say a little bit more about this. It became a system because it developed a really systemic program which allowed it to observe itself and observe interaction on a permanent basis. And finally, because the system became reflexive. The regularity of interaction. A major turning point in that was basically the end of the Napoleonic era and the conclusion of the Congress of Vienna. What you had before was meetings here and there between royals, and these were mostly to conduct alliances or conclude alliances on an ad hoc basis. You had meetings to conclude peace treaties. You had meetings after a war where you first actually always had to have a so-called preliminary peace, a Präliminarfrieden, which needed first of all to establish the basic rules of the game. So you first had to have a preliminary peace in order to be able to sit down and establish who's allowed to speak to whom with what authority and sit where on the table. And only through that ceremonial interaction was a kind of ad hoc interaction system constituted. This is very much reminiscent of the old empire, the old Holy Roman Empire, when the emperor had the council, the Reichstag, and where actually the Reichstag came together, and it was the empire that was constituted at that very moment, and people had to negotiate who actually was able to speak, could speak with what kind of authority, and so on and so on. And this was constantly renegotiated what this kind of social form or system was. And this was the state of affairs in peace negotiations between powers. I think it's premature to speak of countries here, but between powers. And what happens after the Congress of Vienna is the following. The Congress of Vienna sets in motion a long row of congresses, peace congresses. First half of the 19th century sees one peace congress after the other, basically, and what distinguishes those from earlier peace negotiations is that at the end of a congress, it would be the regular expectation that the next one takes place 2, 3, 4 years down the road. We will meet again in order to further discuss. And in addition to that, increasingly also forms would arise which actually regulate the symbolic but not unimportant issues of who actually is entitled to invite others, with what right, who can represent a country, and so on. This is reinforced by an increasing elaboration of diplomatic protocol, an ever denser net of diplomatic representation, and so on, and so on, and so on. So that you can see in a sense that what happens here is not only that the capacity of the cables, so to speak, the capacity of the cables is enhanced, but also there is constant traffic. It's not simple packages of data sent back and forth, but there is constant traffic going back and forth. Still, that does not make a system a system. That's just an increase in the density and intensity of communication. And if you forgive me for again borrowing from the world of computers, but it's about communication, it is about connectivity. And all this also needs a program. This needs a program. And this incidentally, this is not only an issue that in the 19th century is limited to world politics. I mean, it's if you look at connectivity in global traffic, you see a massive increase in traffic, physical traffic, steamship and railroad, and however, the increase in capacity here also requires programs. It requires timetables to be set up. In order to have timetables, you need standardization of time on a global level, and so on and so on. So it's actually a pervasive issue in 19th century global society. And in the system of world politics, my argument, don't be shocked. I'll give an explanation in a second. My argument is that the program that enables the regular communication within the system is actually the program of balance of power. Now, this might sound odd at first. It sounds probably odd for the historians at first, because every historian would rightfully point out that the heydays of the balance of power literature, these were clearly in the 18th century, not in the 19th. But my argument would be it is only in the 19th century, and particularly also with what has been going on with in the Congress of Vienna, with the establishment of the pentarchy, with the regular observation of the evolving system in terms of a balance of power. That balance of power becomes the prevalent mode through which politics in the system of world politics is always also observed. And in a sense, it becomes the regular way of making sense of world politics. Not the only one, but it's the main underlying, if you wish, operating system. It's the operating system. It's not the individual applications you run, Microsoft Word and so on, but it's the operating system. And that in order for that to function, it needs to evolve. It needs to evolve historically and semantically, and that is actually what happens in the 18th century. But only with the Congress of Vienna and in the following is it put to regular use. And I would even go so far. To claim that this is true up to the present day. You cannot make sense in the system of world politics if you do not also always also observe things in terms of a balance of power. Now it's again Russia and China rising again against the others and so on, but it's a mode of observation which is always also there. Mind you to say that this systemic use of balance of power in this function is almost completely, I would say, insensitive to any substantive definitions that one might be tempted to give to the balance of power. If you read that in a realist or whatever kind of way, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It's a mode of observation which is actually used in the system. So we have an increased density of interaction. We have a kind of systemic program, and what in more technical jargon could be called system closure is actually, I would argue, affected by the system of world politics becoming reflexive. And the system becomes reflexive at the very moment in which it conducts politics as if it was observed by an outside. That probably, if there is one point to pin down, that probably happens in the late 1870s in the Berlin Congress, where the powers, if you look at the proceedings, for the first time communicate with each other and act as if they do this not behind doors, but as if observed by a global public. The global public, whatever it is completely irrelevant if that really exists in a structurally meaningful sense. The important point is world politics from there on is conducted as if observed by a global public, in the eyes of the global public, in the eyes later on of world opinion. And this reflexivity of the system actually also gives rise, but that's not something I'm looking into in any detail, but I know somebody who actually does right now. I think this reflexivity from the second half of the 19th century on is exactly what is behind the semantic proliferation of the notion of an international community. That the system starts to describe itself as an international community. So this is, in a nutshell, the idea of how it is possible to describe the emergence of the system of world politics as a subsystem of the political system of world society in the long 19th century. Now, what does that mean for diagnosing the state of the present system of world politics? Is that of any use? I would say it is, and it is of use, first of all, in a typological sense. The system of world politics, as any other social system, is also characterized by its internal differentiation. And you can find both segmentation as well as stratification and functional differentiation at play here. And together with these forms of differentiation go different ordering principles. And sometimes they are maximized individually, sometimes they crisscross each other and lead to forms of structure formation which somehow express both segmentation and stratification, and so on and so on. And my claim would be that looking at the system of world politics through this lens of various forms of social differentiation gives us actually a quite powerful tool to make sense of the variety of forms of organizing political authority in this system. The bewildering variety which we observe of states, of quasi-informal empires, of global governance arrangements, of regions, of organizations, of things that some people claim resembles almost some kind of cosmopolitan or world statehood, or elements of those, even maybe of the so-called ungoverned or failed state spaces. I think this variety can quite neatly be captured by reading the variety through the lens of various forms of social differentiation being present. So, for example, I was hinting at that earlier, the system of territorial states is quite clearly an expression of the segmentation of the system. But there is also stratification very clearly present in the in orders of empire. And although we do not have formal empire anymore, one could describe, at least on various scales, what the US does and what Russia does as forms of empire. System-wide, the differentiation between major, medium, small powers is a figure of organizing political authority that is obviously here to stay. That is a clear indication of stratification. International regimes, global governance, and a global environmental policy, a global economic policy give us an indication of functional differentiation. And I would even go so far to say that sometimes there are forms of organizing political authority that emerge when no form of differentiation can itself establish primacy. And that might go in a relatively orderly fashion. Such as when you have forms of regionalization emerging, which usually combine segmentation. They are defined as segments against others, with functional specification. But this might also take a very unorderly form, and unorderly then means that there is no organizing principle corresponding to a specific form of differentiation that can assert itself against the others. And then we have what to some then appears as a messy state of affairs, failed statehood, ungoverned spaces, which, if you look closer, despite lots of violence, usually are not ungoverned at all. There is authority exerted of whatever kind. We might not normatively like the way it is, but there is organization, there is political organization, but it cannot be fitted. It cannot be fitted into this kind of this basket of the variety of forms of organizing political authority, which go along with one of the prime ways of social differentiation. So this gives us a very powerful typology, and it actually, I actually think, and this is basically where I stop with my thoughts. I think it gives us a couple of important tools for asking questions in further research. On the one hand, I think what this kind of diagnosis about the system of world politics as a socially differentiated system begs is to first of all ask the empirical question of whether, the question of which form of differentiation becomes more important over time in relation to others. What can be achieved by actually systematically addressing such a question is to simply fill the typology with historical data. But it is, so to speak, a historical evolving map of forms of organizing political authority in the system of world politics that would come out of that. And my impression is that this is a much more promising exercise. This is a much more promising exercise than, on the one hand, simply talking about the rise and decline of this or that, which is really a rather one-dimensional way to look at things, but you look at the relative rise and decline of various things vis-à-vis each other over time. And incidentally, I think one of the charms of this approach is that it does one thing that a quite similar school of thought does not. I think the quite similar school of thought is actually global history, and what has been going on by people like Bailey and Osterhammel. I mean, who've also very much focused on the 19th century and explained the emergence of the modern world. The new book by Barry Buzan and George Lawson, it's 19th century emergence, The problem with these folks, although they have tremendously important historical insights, but particularly the global history people, it's in a sense things just flow. And although I am very, very aware of the fact that historians are very keen and rightfully keen to avoid traditional idealist philosophy of history or teleological accounts, I think this does or should not mean that you have to avoid theoretical accounts. These are completely different pairs of shoes. And I think what we are witnessing in the 19th century is a kind of system formation, and that helps to make a lot of sense. And indeed, if you look at what historians do, you will find and be surprised if you haven't found out already that the global historians avoid any talk of an international forming a realm or a sphere of its own. There simply is no grasp to deal with that. So I think such an approach has something important to add. Maybe let me conclude with two thoughts. In that respect. One thought is of a also research pragmatic nature, and the other one is of a more science political nature. In terms of research pragmatics, I think what is also maybe hidden still, but is also hidden in thinking about world politics in these historical terms and in terms of system formation and forms of social differentiation, is actually an interesting research question on large-scale conflict formations. I strongly suspect that as much, what I think everybody would agree to, that as much as the transition from a pre-modern stratified order of society to a modern functional differentiated society was characterized by conflicts through and through, and still is, where nowadays stratification and functional differentiation clash with each other. I would strongly assume that if one follows instances where nowadays different forms of social differentiation clash, and where stratification, for example, or functional differentiation seek to maximize their ordering capacities, conflicts will easily emerge. So I think actually that despite a rather theoretical endeavor, there's also a rather concrete endeavor in terms of conflict studies in here. And finally, also another claim. I have to say, as I said, this talk is based on a manuscript that I just finished a while ago. And although I am socialized in the field of international relations, it was actually only, not when I finished the book, but the manuscript, but quite a long time into it, I realized that I had managed to avoid, save in the intro, I had to avoid, almost was completely avoided making reference to the IR literature until the 5th out of 6 chapters. After which I found a need, and actually to go back and tie discussions, for example, from the English school in. But I have to say that thinking about world politics as a subject which only a few would argue is not at the core of IR as a discipline. I mean, what else is IR about if not world politics? The thinking about this can be done in a rather beneficial way by taking a very historical approach, thus keeping very much with a recent fashion actually to do that, going back to the 19th century, but also taking sociology very seriously. And I hope that thinking about world politics in such a fashion is actually a possible way to be a bit more interdisciplinary than we usually are or claim to be. And it's something that is very hard to actually do, but let's see, maybe I have succeeded just a tiny little bit. But I guess I stop here because I've talked, I guess, about 45 minutes. Yeah? Okay. Thank you.